Good morning, Tamara Dean. Welcome on VH Berries.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
This is a fact. Right now you are based in paradise because you live in a very special place.
This is a fact, yes. I live in the foothills of a beautiful mountain a few hours south of Sydney in Australia.
And I assume, Tamara Dean, this is an infinite source of inspiration for your work.
Indeed, it is. It definitely puts me in touch with kind of the animals and the nature that I am around.
I would love to discuss about your work as a photographer and artist, and so also about your journey. So can you tell us a little bit more about the beginnings and where it all started?
Sure. Well, when I think about the beginning, I think back to when I was a small child and I lived on the edge of a nature reserve. And there was this big tree that came up through our balcony, and I remember the cicadas, these little insects that would sing so loudly, and there was just this overwhelming sense of the kind of sounds and scents and textures of my environment that I was I was nurtured in, and so I think that those years were really formative for me, and I found that once I sort of grew into myself as a teenager and a young woman, I was always yearning to kind of find my way back to nature, to these beautiful kind of environments, and I kind of went off that path for a bit over a decade, where I worked for a newspaper. And that's where I I sort of learnt how to be a photographer on the job, and I did a lot of my training there. And then when I had my daughter in 2005, I remembered that I wanted to get back into my artistic photography, and I took the time to start developing my art practice. And from there, I began working on conceptual photographic projects and exhibiting once a year. And that kind of leads me to now, where I'm represented by Michael Reed in Sydney and Berlin, and have a very exciting art practice that I'm exploring.
That led you to a lot of things, including Jinks in the Hydrangeas.
Yes, indeed. So this is the series that I've been working on since March last year, when we first went into lockdown. And would you like me to tell you a bit about that series?
Absolutely, with a lot of pleasure.
Previous to this series, my focus for the past number of years has been on trying to express as kind of poetically as I can that humans are a part of nature, and I've tried to draw parallels between the human figure and the landscape, and trying to show that intrinsic connection. But when I came to last year, when the lockdown first happened, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to rely on having models to pose for me, people to be in my photographs. And the only person I could really draw on and rely on was myself. So at the same time, I also was approached by this incredibly exciting new gallery called Nun and Gula, they invited me to be the inaugural artist to create a body of work to open that exhibition in September this year. And so I had this really great focus on which I could kind of work towards an exhibition. And I found that I found a kind of daily practice that enabled me to just, at the end of each day, I'd head out onto our property, and I'd head out with my camera and sometimes a light and just myself, and I I'd just see what I could come up with, and there wasn't a lot of pre-planning. It was very intuitive and it was very spontaneous, and it would be drawing on the materials I found around me and using them as props and using my body in a way I'd never used it before, and I guess asking of myself what I would ask of the people I'd ordinarily be photographing. So I ended up pushing myself to do things I never would have done, even as a child, really, where I was sort of climbing upside down on trees, and ended up having to ask my son to rescue me a couple of times because I got sort of so caught up in the acrobatics of it. But it was incredibly cathartic, and it was a really amazing reminder that I don't have to go far to take photographs. I literally, I mean, I wouldn't even have to walk out the door, but I chose to walk out the door, and that's where I was able to make work that both fed me on a creative level and nurtured my my mental health in a time where it was a real struggle not knowing what was going to be happening in the world, and so it was quite healing and a really transformative series to work on personally.
Tamara Dean, that sounds very funny because it's spontaneous, no preparation. This is improvisation.
Yes.
In fact, when I took a deeper look on your photograph, I found out that a very important aspect in your work would be the fact to live as a human in a specific time, so in our modern era, and trying to reframe and make a connection between, on one side, the humans, and on the other side, the environment.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess the concept that underpins most of the work that I make, sort of, and probably from the beginning, but in a more succinct way now, is I'm just trying to really make the point that humans are a part of nature. And I think we're at a time in our contemporary lives where the climate crisis is really writ large in our lives, and I feel like the disconnection of humanity to our environment has led to this in a way. And for me, to start making that symbolic connection in my work, trying to reframe that idea of the human as part of an ecosystem, as part of nature, as opposed to something or someone that sits outside of it, I feel like that is a really important point that needs to be made, and that is worth really thinking on. And the consequences that we the effect we have on our environment is it's what we're doing to ourselves. If we're killing our environment, we're eroding our own health. It's so connected, and I feel like it's a time where that's a really important message that I can tell in my work.
And because, Tamara Dean, we are in an ecosystem, us and the nature, in your upcoming exhibition, you want to put the two aspects together, for example, by putting some humans on trees and vice versa.
Yes, that's right. So I've put my body, I've really sort of sunk my body into the nature, the environment that I've entered. So I created it on my property and also in other private gardens. So I'd find areas where there was like maybe a whole lot of flowers in bloom, and I'd bury myself into them, or I'd find a crevice in the earth and I'd fill the earth with my body, and I just tried to find ways that I could become part of the story of the plant rather than the plant becoming my story, rather than picking it and taking it away into my world. I kind of threw my body into the world of the plants and the earth, and it was a what you can start to see coming through in the photographs is a sense of I really found that part of COVID where I'd go into public and there'd be these invisible particles. I found that incredibly stressful, as obviously many people do, But also previous to that, we'd had this humongous bushfire, the Currawong bushfire, which led to us having to evacuate our home a number of times, and our place was overcome with smoke. And so I really wanted to kind of draw on these really serious experiences I'd been through. The smoke had been, and the fires had created such a sense of terror in my home environment that I thought I was going to have to move away. But with COVID only coming in a few months later, it turned that whole experience of terror and fear into suddenly that our home and where we live became a place of sanctuary. And so the series not only sort of speaks to those serious themes, it also has a sense of kind of topsy-turvy upside downness, because it was sort of like my world completely turned upside down in ways that I'd never anticipated or imagined. And so the series has a few things going on. It's got the kind of anxiety and fear surrounding the fires and COVID, but then there's this sense of humor and playfulness that comes with me having been both model and photographer, and just sort of looking at myself from the outside and thinking how silly I must have looked, running back and forth between the camera to set off the timer. And it was a funny experience to be in both of those roles. And I feel like that comes through in it as well in the series.
And this is a success because your exhibition is the answer to the pandemic.
Well, it certainly has helped me through this time. And I think it still speaks to the idea that we are a part of nature, but probably in a more in a less straightforward way. It's a little bit more subtle in that message.
And Tamara Dean, if I understood correctly, you are the only model in this very specific exhibition because, for example, on one of the pictures, we can see a model with a dance dress, classic music dance dress, and there are 3 persons. So is that you on the 3 sides?
Yeah, so I because I only had myself to work with, I decided that I would use my figure the way that I would draw on when I'd have models. So there are certain images where I've repeated my figure so that to give a sense of, I guess, energy and rhythm through the photograph. So there's one where I look like it's called Escapade, and it's like I'm running from some invisible kind of terror, and I've got my figure repeated 4 times, sort of tumbling down a landscape, and that was quite an interesting shoot because it appears that there's this sort of flow to it, but the reality of the shoot was me running back to the camera between every single acrobatic kind of motion I did, and tried to kind of, it was interesting turning what was quite a sort of calm and sublime scene into this sort of pantomime of myself rolling through it.
Hold on, Tamara Dean. On Escapade, you are not laying on the floor. You are falling for me.
Yes, I'm very much in action.
So, for example, for this very particular picture, you mean that you put it and installed the tripod and camera on the top of a small hill, for example, and then you activated it through a remote control, for example?
So, no, I didn't have a remote control, but yes, I did put the camera on a tripod on a hill. And at that point, it was at the very beginning of the series, and I hadn't worked out how to take a number of photographs at any one time. So I was literally running back to press the self timer every time I would take a photograph. I'd run back, press the self timer, run back. So it was my feet were very sore and cut by the end of it, but I don't know. I wonder if because I had to keep doing that, maybe there's a sense of energy in the photograph that carries through. I'm not sure.
in addition to these multiple aspects in this exhibition, we can really feel the impact of the bushfire that you just mentioned before. For example, on one picture that is called Smoke Signals.
Yeah, so smoke signals. Again, I began the shoot by placing myself within a plant. So we had this beautiful plant that was in bloom, and so I kind of climbed up through the vine, and I actually had my son throwing this powder at me to try and give the sense of the smoke that we'd been living through, and it's sort of, it kind of, the photograph makes it appear that I'm sort of looking above the smoke to see what's coming, which was very much my experience of the fires, because we live on the side of the mountain that is the opposite to the side that the fire front was approaching from. So it was very much, I would have to climb the hill each day to the very top to see how quickly and how close the fires were approaching. So there's this sort of sense of like keeping watch and seeing what's happening in the distance and trying to rise above the smoke. And yeah, that photograph is the most direct reference to the fires.
And Tamara Dean, you mentioned your son multiple times. You mean that he is the best assistant ever that you could have?
He is the best assistant ever, yes, and he would love to hear me saying that. He actually is amazing. He helped me a huge amount, and he took it all within his. He was very graceful about it all, and he also enjoyed throwing powder at me. I think maybe a little bit too much sometimes.
I am pretty sure that your work is having a huge influence on him, and that maybe he is going to continue the legacy and become an artist, maybe.
Maybe, yeah. At the moment, he's he's very connected to the ocean. So I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up doing something with the ocean. But yeah, we'll see.
And I'm also very curious about the multiple acres property in which you are installed, because you told me there are some animals. So this is a huge playground.
It is, and it's been an interesting place to live, because when we first moved here, it was about 5 or 6 years ago, and the entire property, or almost the entire property, was grown with very tough weeds that were sort of 2 meters tall. And so I've spent a lot of time with my husband really bringing the weeds under control and trying to regenerate the property. And so we've planted hundreds of trees, and it's really interesting because whilst I've done that, I've also been kind of shaping the environment, and it's a wonderful thing to be making these photographs in this environment, which I've also had a hand in kind of forming. So as I tame the weeds back and start to plant new life, that then becomes part of the world that I photograph within. So I find something quite special about that part too, because it's sort of, none of it would have existed in this way if I hadn't been in that landscape to kind of shape it that way. So it's a really interesting process working with land and over time in that way as well, creatively.
At this point, Tamara Dean, you are able to build a helicopter airport and everything that you want.
Yeah, maybe on a smaller scale, but yes, very much so. Definitely bodies of water. I've built dams of water and putting beautiful lotuses and creating these idyllic kind of places where the animals come and drink from as well. So it's pretty special.
And what are the most particular and funny things that you met during these last 5-6 years in this property?
Do you mean animals?
I mean everything. For example, events, paranormal activities. I don't know.
Look, the thing that stands out most clearly, which wasn't funny, was the fires. That was an experience I never thought that I would have in my life. It's interesting because we live, it's sort of old dairy land. So we're on land where there's little bits of forest, but it's mostly clear, except for what we're planting. I guess when I moved here, I didn't really think that this was the kind of place that would burn. You sort of imagine that a fire might take place in a big forest and burn, but the fire was so terrifying. It was burning on air alone. So it was a really crazy way to start imagining the fire approaching, because trees would just burst into flames. And so we had to cut back all of anything that was close to the house. And you started looking at your landscape. I started looking at our landscape in a way of how it would respond to the fire, it's not a way I've ever looked at a landscape before. Sort of when I'd see a gum tree, I wouldn't see this beautiful, slender, graceful tree. I would see a bomb virtually, because once the fire hits those gum leaves, there's so much oil in them that it just goes up in seconds, less than seconds. So it was a very troubling experience, and very traumatizing actually. That when I think of, I know that there's obviously very lovely things that have happened here too, but if I think of the most intense thing, that was definitely it. It changed everything about the way I saw the world.
That was intense. And concerning your the bushfires, were all the land was affected by it?
Our property is fine. There was a particular day that the winds were meant to bring the fire to where we live. And so we were expecting we would lose our home and everything. But then our fortune that day was that the winds took it a different way, but then that became someone else, it became devastation for other people, and it took out an entire town near us, as in like the bushland. And it burnt so hot that there's still areas now where there's no growth. It was just unfathomable. So we were very lucky, but our luck, was our luck. There was a lot of awfulness not far away. My mother-in-law lost her home and is still trying to get to a point where she can rebuild, and it was very personal.
It is very personal, Tamara Dean, and also on a more positive side, you have this luck to experiment, for example, all the 4 seasons with all the nature.
That's right. And so this series was, I guess for me, it was a cathartic experience where I could start to re-engage with my environment and looking for the beauty and looking for the poetry and looking for the connections and watching the seasons and the way that everything changed and changes. So it and I suppose like being in lockdown means that you really are slowing down and watching those cycles in life happen on a much more intimate level, which has been quite a profound experience.
Tamara Dean, I'm wishing you the best for this exhibition that is going to open in 2 weeks at the moment where we are talking right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. It's an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you.